I'm Bob, and this here is my place.
You're going to get some opinions.
I'm Bob. Would you knock me out, please?
Mixed in with a little news, the latest weather, some sports, and maybe even a little reminiscing.
About a song from 1962.
And you're almost guaranteed to hear something that's going to make you smile.
Bob, we love playing here tonight.
But if you're not careful, you might even learn a thing or two.
Very interesting.
Live from the studios of Longport Media, it's time for Bob Burns in your afternoon.
We'll talk to Bob.
And now, here's Bob.
Hey, what's going on? It's, what's today? Today's Tuesday, right? It's Tuesday. It's, April 22nd, and on the line we have Ted Corless. Ted Corless is an attorney from Florida. We spoke with Ted a little while ago about sinkholes, and this is one of Ted's other little things he works on a little bit. Ted, how you doing?
I'm great, Bob. Great to hear from you.
And just so you know, Sunday was also my birthday.
On Easter 420, the planets indeed aligned for you.
That's correct. Well, it was the first time in my lifetime it's ever been on Easter. We have our weather guy who was in a couple of weeks ago. He said the last time it happened was sometime in the 30s, and that was a few years before I was born, and it won't happen again till after I'm dead, I believe. But I cherish the 420 day. I cherish the fact that I want to meet at the statue and smoke a joint. That's how 420 started.
That's right. That's right. You know the story behind that expression, then, obviously.
It's not a bad story to tell, though, because I don't think a lot of people know that. Because I got a couple greetings, that 420, yeah, meet me at the statue. What the hell are you talking about?
Right. That's right. That's right.
Tell us a little bit about Ted Corless for a minute. We've had you on before. I have your website up, which is newsmunchies.com. All sorts of interesting stuff there, all podcasts, all sorts of cool stuff. Read about. And tell us.
We were and the podcast we did with you folks a couple of months ago did extremely well, and I really appreciate that listening audience. We picked up a lot of people on our Twitter feed from that as well, at News Munchies, and we're right now we're focusing a lot on social issues, and the issue of cannabis legalization or decriminalization is one that we're getting a lot of feedback from.
Yeah, it's a really, really volatile subject right now, and I have. I have your talking points, and I read through everything that was in there, and there's some great stuff in there. And then I have some questions too. But let me go back a step here. Now, you at one time were involved in a big law firm, correct?
That's right. I worked for a law firm that at one point was the 44th largest law firm in the world, and I spent a fair amount of time representing big tobacco, specifically Philip Morris and Lorillard Tobacco. And that really took me into a lot of different places in science and in the legal community, and a lot of the things that I've done since then have been in that area. Politics has always been something important to me, and the issues, a lot of these social issues. Gay marriage is something that I write a lot about, issues associated with, with pot or cannabis legalization, a lot of things dealing with military families, a lot of issues associating with helping people who are returning to the community after serving in the military in either Afghanistan or Iraq. And so I spent about 6 months last year doing a Fox-sponsored radio program of my own out of Tampa, Florida. And I was the guy that I used to describe it as a small L libertarian rant, meaning that not necessarily the libertarians that you might find Ron Paul, but simply someone who believes that we need to toss all these descriptors of people being conservative or liberal and talk about issues and not people.
I have to tell you, I call myself a conservative Democrat. I call myself a JFK Democrat. I was in 1960. I was when JFK was elected. I guess I was probably 14 or 15. But 60, no, I would have been, I would have been 12. Okay, so I was 12 years old. Anyway, I have a lot of people that go, boy, you're really a good guy for a Democrat. And I just want to tell them, well, you're not a bad person for an a-hole. But,
right. We would do a show on anything from the death penalty, or we did a show right after the Boston bombing where I interviewed one of the professors of one of the bombers. And during the show, I received 3 phone calls. One phone call was from a guy who called me a Nazi, The second phone call, the guy called me a communist.
Yeah.
And the third guy called me something I don't think I want to say on your radio program. And when that happened, we knew we were hitting a nerve.
That's good. It's always good. When you rile somebody up, that's really good. All right, so let's talk about. Well, you're probably going to call it cannabis. I had a lady on from let me see, New Jersey weed or New Jersey something. Lauren, New Jersey Normal. I had a lady on from New Jersey Normal not too long ago. Thank God for Lauren. I mean, she's got the brain that activates. Mine is a little slow sometimes. We had her on, and she always referred to it as cannabis, and you'll probably refer to it as cannabis, and I think I'm just going to call it weed.
That's fine. And I think what a lot of us in the media that are covering this are, the reason we're pushing that direction is that if you look back in the 30s when people were discussing getting rid of prohibition, for example, when the conversations or the presentations were being made, people referred to it as alcohol. We're trying to put it in a more objective stance. And if you use the word marijuana, actually marijuana is the worst of all. It's the most slang because it was a derogatory term that came up to describe Mexicans and Mexican cannabis that was coming over the border during the first part of the 20th century. And so a lot of us just feel that if we're going to talk about this from a technical standpoint, using the technical word seems to be the most appropriate.
Okay. All right. So you'll call it cannabis, and I'll call it weed.
And I'll know what you're talking about.
Okay, you get it all figured out. Well, that's the interesting thing is that when it was lumped with a bunch of stuff in the 30s and was made illegal, and the stuff that it was bunched with has got no relevance at all to weed, right?
It really doesn't, because at the time, before the Controlled Substances Act was passed, they were looking at a lot of different things, most of it with no pharmacological basis. There was even a consideration as to whether or not they would make tea or coffee illegal as well, because they were attempting to control the market for those particular items. Opiates, were being used usually in a tincture form, where they would take raw opium and mix it with alcohol to make laudanum. That a lot of people would use as a pain medication. But because laudanum had such a massive, because it was something that was so easy to synthesize into a product that could be sold out of pharmacies or drugstores, people decided to keep it around. But cannabis was lumped in large part because there was a social stigma associated with it, and people just thought it kind of broke their brand.
The stuff that was included in that bill was heroin and cocaine. Right. Was there another drug in there? Or was
there were some other, at that point, there were some synthetic drugs that people would make. There was a precursor to PCP that was actually being used in an agricultural format as a tranquilizer for horses. Uh-huh. And that ultimately became legalized for about 20, 25 years. I think sometime in the 50s they finally decided that PCP was a bad one, and they moved it from a Schedule 3 to a Schedule 1.
Oh, okay. All right. And so it just, well, I had a we did we did a show about I had somebody from Ithaca College interview me about 1968, what a dramatic year that was in our history, and it turned out that was the first year I smoked a joint, was in 1968, and it was in Massapequa, New York, and Long Island, and I went to see a college friend of mine, and that was my first experience with it. So I'm not new to the rodeo. And right. I've heard all these things, it's a gateway drug, it's this, it's the next thing, and I project that people that also drank water took heroin and cocaine, and so maybe water's really the gateway drug.
Well, that particular issue, let me give you my context for it. I graduated from the University of Missouri in 1989. In 1988, at age 20, I moderated a debate between the president of the Missouri organization of NORML when he was debating two DEA agents. The NORML guy also had the professor of criminology. And And the interesting thing about it was all of the arguments that we hear now against either legalization or decriminalization, whatever these words mean, because they're very confusing. They're all the same arguments, and the gateway argument was the one that they were gambling the most on. But despite the fact that cannabis growth has been pretty steady since the 1980s, it's obviously up now. I don't know that it's up so much as that people are just out about it. But that issue has been studied by a variety of universities and completely debunked. The reality is that people who are participating in high-risk enterprises, if it's cocaine or if it's heroin or if it's driving their car at 125 miles an hour, are people that really don't care if the state or Fed or government tells them that something is illegal. It doesn't mean that it leads to other drugs. But I mean, Bud Light then is the gateway drug ultimately for everything, because because I bet you anyone who smoked a joint probably had a Bud Light at some time prior to that. At least.
All right. So let's talk about the legality of weed. And that always intrigues me. The legality of weed, and it's got lots of classifications. So let's discuss that for a few minutes.
Okay. When we write about cannabis on News Munchies, what we always try and do is approach these issues from the most fundamental level that we can, because I'm not necessarily trying to advocate a particular position as much as I want to give people an opportunity to know the foundation of their argument so they can make it better. We may not agree when we're done. And when we started looking at the issue of cannabis legalization, the first thing we discovered is that legal doesn't always mean legal. Or legal can mean legal, but it doesn't mean you can gain access to it. So let me give you an example. I was in Hawaii about 3 weeks ago interviewing a few people about cannabis for the book we're working on. And, the interesting thing about Hawaii is, Maui Wowie is one of the most famous strains of cannabis that's ever existed.
Yeah.
But you can't buy it anywhere, even though it's legal to possess cannabis. So it's legal to possess cannabis in Hawaii, but it's not legal to sell cannabis. Okay.
It drops out of the trees, right?
It does. I mean, and they allow you to grow, for example, up to 7 mature plants, but you can never possess more than an ounce of cannabis at any particular moment.
Uh-huh.
Now, forget about the fact that 7 mature plants can generate over a pound of weed, so 16 times the legal amount.
Right.
So you're growing your 7 mature plants, but the minute it becomes 1 ounce of pot, you have to throw the rest of it away.
Oh, okay.
So is that legal? I guess it is. Right now the only 2 states that we could really call truly legal would be Colorado and Washington State.
Uh-huh.
And according to Governor Christie this morning, he's going to make sure that under no circumstances is cannabis ever going to be legal in New Jersey.
Yeah, he talks like he's going to be governor for life.
Well, since I brought that up, the funny thing is, looking at the quote from him, the Colorado law is not the quality of life that we want. The funny thing about that is the majority of the people in New Jersey, even if they don't smoke pot or if they do smoke pot, want cannabis to be legal.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't know who the we is that he's referring to. And I think that's really the reason this issue always fascinates me, is because it's more of a statement about more government, not less government. It's about the government representatives believing that they know better than the people themselves on an issue like this.
All right, Ted. We're with Ted Corless. He's an attorney from Florida, and we're talking about the legalization of weed. And Ted, we need to take a quick break. We're going to be back in just a couple minutes, and we have a lot of stuff to talk about here. And I have some. Well, I have my general, usual stupid questions. So when we come back, we'll continue to go through this about legalizing weed. Ted Corless, appreciate you being there. Just hold on for a couple minutes. All right.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be back just in a couple minutes.
News Talk 1400, WOND.
Bob Burns and Your Afternoon continues on News Talk 1400 WOND.
All right, we're back. We're talking with Ted Corless. He's an attorney out of Tampa, Florida. We're talking about legalization of weed. And let me see, Ted, Colorado and Washington. Only two states to fully legalize weed for recreational purposes.
That's right. That's right. Instead, if you take a look, compare Colorado, for example, with New Jersey. Colorado, a non-resident can walk in and buy a quarter ounce of cannabis per day. And in New Jersey, you can only possess however much you can possess. I think it's up to an ounce. But you can only possess it if you fall within the medical marijuana provision, which requires that you have one of the few diseases that the politicians decided they will permit you to use it for. I mean, I'm not trying to be crass, but you realize that it's the only medication, and New Jersey has now decided, whether you agree with it or not, it's medication.
Right.
But if your doctor wants to give you opium or an opium derivative like OxyContin that kills thousands of people every year, if your doctor wants to give you that for a mild headache, they don't have to have any more of a reason than their own medical opinion.
Right.
But if in New Jersey a doctor wants to give you cannabis for multiple sclerosis, you have to go down and register as a user, and that information is readily available to anyone who wants to know that you are, in fact, a pot smoker.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
It really is.
People joke about the insurance companies, telling doctors what to do. Now we have legislators telling doctors what to do. I mean, it's getting a little out of hand here. But I think it comes from the top. We have a governor who is adamantly against it because he wants to run for president, and he would not be the first guy running for president that legalized pot. So, I understand where that comes from. I don't like it, but I understand it.
We were giving out News Munchies coffee cups, and the back of the News Munchies had the names of the four presidents, the last four presidents, by the way, who have admitted to using cannabis. And had they been arrested using cannabis, they would have been charged as felons, and they would have never been allowed to run for office.
Who were the four presidents?
Well, Obama, Bush, Clinton, and I think both Bushes have admitted to smoking pot.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, but Clinton didn't inhale, is what he says, right?
He didn't inhale, right? He wasn't. He was wasteful.
Yeah, let's talk about that for about 2 seconds. Okay, so cannabis or weed's illegal in these states, but you can't take it out of the states. And,
that's right.
Here's the part that really bothers me, and I'm going to skip ahead. Right now, the federal government has decided that they're not going to prosecute anybody in those states where it's legal. Right? So even though it's legal in Colorado and Washington, it's still a federal offense. They still can't. You still can't possess marijuana federally, right? So
that's right. Right.
You can follow through with this. I think you know where I'm going with this, but go ahead.
Well, here a couple of things about that. What happened back in October was Eric Holder, Attorney General, United States Attorney General, issued a memo to the United States attorneys all over the 50 states. And what he said was he was changing what he described as, quote, operational objectives, which meant that the feds were not going to routinely investigate cannabis use in states where it was legal unless it fell into one of three categories. Either it was being sold to children, it was being transferred over state lines, or it was being used to fund an existing drug cartel from a foreign country. Now, as a lawyer, let me tell you this much. The question I get is it legal now under federal law? No. If you get caught and the feds want to arrest you for possession, I can't take out Eric Holder's memo, walk into court and say, look, it's legal. No, it just means that the feds are not going to focus so much on that. The interesting thing about that, too, is within 2 weeks of that memo coming out, there was a federal raid in Seattle on 21 dispensaries. And so I don't know what that means. I mean, when I talk to growers in California, for example, their biggest issue has always been that the feds would not allow money, exchanged for cannabis in California legally, to be deposited in federally insured banks because it was being described as nothing more than money laundering. And so what was happening, especially in San Francisco, is that you saw violent crime near cannabis dispensaries skyrocket because people were going into these dispensaries and robbing them because they knew they had large amounts of cash. People can't use credit cards, for example, to buy cannabis in those states.
All right, Ted, we have a call from an anonymous, so let's see what this anonymous has to say. Anonymous,
Very
you're
good.
on the air. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Actually, I just wanted to say, again, I was born in 1960. I'm 53 years old. I have a college and high school education, raised two great kids, both graduated from college. I've paid my mortgage for 25 years, been employed all these years. And yes, it's younger days I did smoke pot. And, one of the things as I grew up was the fact that, I never turned me on to other drugs or such. But, the illegality of it and working was always a situation. So, in Atlantic City today, you work for the casinos, you really can't do that activity anymore. What is the situation when it comes to employment in California and Colorado and drug testing and corporate policies, which says that it's illegal, you can't, or not that it's illegal, but they just don't allow it as a corporate policy for an employee?
Let me tell you, in both Colorado and Washington, despite the fact that cannabis is now legal under state law, an employer has a right to drug test you and to fire you if you test positive for any form of cannabinoid. So
yes,
it's
just a random test, not based upon something, an injury or an accident or something like that, and they go to a hair test. If you're doing something that's legal in the state, they could still fire you for it.
That's right. You'd be subject to the usual laws regarding drug testing. Now, I will tell you, in the state of Florida, when the issue by Rick Scott came up about drug testing state employees, one of the biggest issues was that the legislators wanted a 10-day warning before they got their drug test. But that's a different conversation.
Well, again, I do support the legalization of it. The dangers and evils that they put out there over the years are certainly not there. You look at alcohol use, tobacco use, and as we've seen with OxyContin and all these other things, that there's obviously a much larger danger out there than what this is. It's just a political, firecracker that no one wants to put in their hands, it seems. But I think eventually it will get to where it should be.
Well, one of the things I appreciate you doing is reaching out and sharing those stories, because I think it's important for people to out themselves about smoking pot. I smoke a low THC, high CBN cannabis for migraines that I get about 4 times a year. I had to buy it illegally and transfer it into Florida. I keep it in below 20 grams so that in the event I get caught, it's only a misdemeanor. I pay my taxes. I run 3 businesses. I have a family. And it's the reality is that the idea that the pot smoker is some kid who's hanging out at a statue, it's just not accurate anymore.
And then, to me, the biggest hypocrisy is, I believe it's called Charlotte's Web, is the strain that is extremely low THC, but has the product that helps that's been used to help children with epilepsy and with seizures and things like that. I don't know if you were told, but in New Jersey there was a father of a child who went to the governor and made the point that I guess at that particular time children or anyone under the age of 18 could not be prescribed for marijuana use, and that he was trying to say that it does help his daughter with stroke, with epilepsy and things like that, and yet the governor still, if I remember correctly, said no, that they would do further research on it, but no, that prescribing for a child would be entirely inappropriate. So obviously he knows better than what the medical community would say.
He's a genius. He's a genius.
Well, good luck. And again, it is something that I think is timely and will be more addressed. And I think more adults, as they are doing in these other areas, need to address it in a reasonable way.
I appreciate you checking in. Thanks, man.
Okay.
All right. Here's what happened in the state of New Jersey. This was recently, there was a gentleman who was working for the New Jersey Transit, which is our bus business, a bus and train and, buses and trains. And he was prescribed medical marijuana for I'm going to say it was MS, but I'm not exactly positive. So I'm not really sure what he was prescribed it for. And when they did a random drug test, he obviously, tested positive for weed. And the state Supreme Court decided that he could be fired because of the federal statute that applies to New Jersey Transit. There's the federal CDL laws. And so that really gets into a real mix there, doesn't it?
It really does, because so many of those rules do not apply to other medications that can impair your ability to drive an automobile or operate heavy machinery. And the reason for that should be pretty obvious, because the big pharma has such a hold on the legislatures that they're never going to allow any limitation on their ability to sell their drugs, because that's really what this is about. It's that big pharma, big alcohol, even big gambling. You should know, the folks in Atlantic City, that there are a number of studies that reflect that cannabis can be an effective treatment protocol for people who suffer from obsessive-compulsive disorders, which are usually the disorders associated with compulsive gamblers. Huh. And so they have no interest in reducing the number of people that want to be compulsive gamblers. But I mean, I think that, keeping this in context, I don't think anyone is going to suggest that people should be allowed the unbridled access to or the unbridled use of cannabis. Instead, I think what people want is they want the government out of these decisions. They don't want the legislators like Christie or state legislators like we have here in Florida to make decisions about decisions made between people and their doctors. That's why this issue is slowly not becoming so much about the ability of people to smoke pot, and it's more about the role of government in our day-to-day lives.
Here's the other piece that bothers me about Eric Holder's memo to his people, not to prosecute, is that when this administration is gone and a new administration comes in, there's a distinct possibility that new administration could decide we're going to enforce these federal laws and we don't care what the state laws are.
Well, you're exactly right, because that's what happened when then Governor Bush became President Bush. All the presidents had this big stack of orders that they signed within a certain number of days of becoming president.
Right.
And when Bush took over, there had been a push away from limitations on access to stem cell research. Uh-huh. But because the religious right has a problem with that, one of the first things that Bush did in office was to stall federal funding for the use of stem cell research. Well, if a Republican president takes over, you're clearly going to see problems associated with limits on prosecution. Although the Obama administration has been no friend to the cannabis industry. The only thing I tell people is that if Mitt Romney had been elected, you would have seen Apache helicopters over dispensaries in California. I mean, I was at the 420 convention in Denver last year interviewing people outside, and there was 25,000 people there. Uh-huh. Everyone smoking pot. There wasn't even so much as a push or a fight. And they were giving cannabis out by the fistfuls. They literally were throwing joints at people, and I never saw one fight, and there were no cops there.
How about
now,
that?
Let me ask you, if we filled a room or filled an auditorium of 25,000 people and gave everyone a bottle of tequila,
oh my gosh,
how many people would have beat the turkey out of each other?
Just for a drink, right?
Right. But the point being that when I was sitting there, we had low-flying helicopters flying over the event that were Apache helicopters. And somebody said, "Oh, look, it's the cops." And I said, "Dude, cops don't own Apache helicopters."
That's the feds. Yeah, that's the feds for sure. All right. Yeah. I have to take another break, but what I would rather do is just keep you on the line for another few minutes, and then I'll take the break after we hang up, and I can just close out the show, close out the hour. Two things that kind of disturb me, and the first one is some people have said in Colorado they've attributed 2 deaths to smoking weed. Reflect on those two things.
One of those deaths was associated with a woman that they found a number of other medications in her system at the time of her death, and the the autopsy that took place ultimately resulted in a conclusion of inconclusive. They were not able to determine what killed her, and the medical examiner, simply having no other alternative, just decided subjectively to blame it on cannabis. Understanding how much cannabis you would have to ingest, it's somewhere within an hour time frame you would have to ingest approximately 1,500 pounds of cannabis in order for it to kill you. In fact, we're gathering some data right now, but I'm not ready to say it, but we think that Play-Doh might actually be more dangerous than cannabis because of the wheat allergies associated with it. But the other death that has been attributed to it was simply someone who apparently got too high and jumped off of a 6-story building.
Okay. So that could happen anyway, right?
Right. I mean, at the same time, how many people do you know, for example, in the state of Florida, in 2012, over 1,500 people died from the legal use of OxyContin. But right now, Big Pharma is developing a new opiate that is being described as 4 times stronger than that. So if we're going to measure the efficacy of drugs based upon the number of deaths, I'll even admit to the 2 Colorado deaths if they want me to do that.
The last thing I'd like you to talk about is public opinion. Public opinion. Supposedly, if we vote for something, it becomes law. And public opinion seems to be pretty strong one way about weed. Right.
Well, if you look at the most conservative polls that I've seen by, I don't know that I can name them chapter and verse, but I've seen that 58% of self-described Republicans believe that the drug war is a failure and that cannabis should, at a minimum, be decriminalized. That's a sea change over what it was in 1980, right when you saw the Just Say No campaign adopted by the Reagan administration. People just don't believe that people should go to jail for it. And a lot of people believe, especially after they get to know people that are responsible that smoke pot. I mean, no one believes that 10-year-olds should be able to walk into a 7-Eleven and buy cannabis any more than they believe they should be able to buy malt liquor. Right. But no one's calling for the illegalization of those items.
All right. So pretty much the public opinion, though, the public polls that we've seen over the past couple of years have shown that over 50% of the people in almost every state that I've seen this number for are in favor of legalization of recreational use of marijuana.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons why I push back on Governor Christie's statement that we don't want this. Well, we must be you and your political advisors,
right? Because
the people that voted you into office think otherwise. I mean, I think that, as you pointed out earlier, he's going to run for president. He can't be. It's a litmus test at some point for the uber neocons that they want the government to control certain components of your life. It's not about Christie believing in less government. It's less other people's government and more of his. And again, when we write on News Munchies, we focus a lot on getting away from calling ourselves libertarian or calling ourselves conservatives. In the end, most people are socially moderate. Most people are fiscally conservative, and they're politically done with a lot of these issues. They don't want to hear about abortion. They don't want to hear about a lot of these other issues that are just being used to keep people riled up. And cannabis is really the last vestige of a culture war that ended decades ago.
I got a kick about the last piece here about edibles and concentrates.
It's absolutely amazing at this point from a pharmacological standpoint what they can put cannabis in anymore. You want it in salad dressing? Sure. Everyone's heard about pop brownies, but have you ever seen a soda pop that one serving is found in a half bottle of soda that tastes like grape juice?
Oh my gosh!
And the concentrates that they're making that people either ingest or smoke are, people talk about the fact that the current cannabis is so much stronger than it was back in the 60s and 70s. But what they don't realize is that there is cannabis derivatives right now that are 80% THC as opposed to 8% of a lot of the Mexican cannabis that people were smoking in the 70s.
How about that?
And it still hasn't triggered any deaths, and it still hasn't triggered any other problems.
Yeah, I like what you said. You'd have to eat 1,500 pounds of marijuana. Is that what you had to eat?
Right. That's right.
And being aggressive on weed, I don't think that really happens. I think people get mellowed out, don't they?
Yeah, I was so taken by that event in Colorado, in large part because I found out later that they had about 3 times the number of people that they had planned for.
Uh-huh.
And, I don't know anybody who's ever gotten high and then went and punched somebody in the face.
Not quite.
They're hiding Doritos or something.
We have a question from Teresa. Let's talk to Teresa for a second. Go ahead, Teresa, you're on the air.
Hi, I'm just curious. I just tuned in a little while ago, but I'm curious about secondhand smoke. Is there any issue with that? And if there is, how does it compare with the campaign against smoking and all the ban on smoking?
I spent 2 years representing Philip Morris in tobacco litigation, and one of the things that you actually discover is that tobacco smoke is not the same as pot smoke. What's bad about tobacco smoke is that it's replete with nitrosamines, and nitrosamines are specific to nicotine, and that's what you're ingesting from secondhand smoke that is so bad for you. But there are no nitrosamines in cannabis smoke. So cannabis smoke is actually considerably less dangerous than tobacco. Now, that doesn't mean that people should be ingesting, this kind of carbon material all the time. And it's not good for you. It definitely, smoking is smoking, except smoking tobacco is a lot worse.
Okay, so will there be a campaign as rigorous against pot smoking on the beaches and in the parks and in stadiums and baseball fields and public buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
The current generation of cannabis laws are very driven towards the private consumption of cannabis. Even in Colorado and in Washington, the use of cannabis in public places is extremely limited, and in areas where it would be a cannabis restricted area. Now, for example, if you look at Breckenridge, Colorado, they have passed a local ordinance that moves any cannabis consumption out of the mainstream areas. So as someone who might be a regular visitor to those areas, you would never encounter any kind of cannabis smoke unless you went to a cannabis place where people are smoking it openly.
All right, Teresa.
So let me ask, though, about is the non-smoking, would non-smoking apply to that as well as regular smoking?
Oh, without a doubt.
The laws?
Most definitely.
Without a doubt.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Teresa.
That. Thanks.
Take care. We're talking with Ted Corless. Ted Corless is an attorney from Tampa, Florida, and our discussion today was weed. And the website is newsmunchies.com. And Ted, we certainly appreciate you coming to the phone today and talking to us about this. I look at your website here, and there's a ton of other things we can talk about. So,
well, I'd love to do that sometime, Bob, and I always enjoy talking to you.
Good, Ted. Thank you very much. Ted Corless, newsmunchies.com. Thanks, Ted. We'll be right back after these messages.
South Jersey's News Talk, 1400 WOND.
All right. That was a pretty cool talk there with Ted Corless. He's got a lot of cool stuff on his website, and it's newsmunchies.com. He attacks all kinds of different things. In fact, our last interview with him was up there about sinkholes, and it's got 4,751 hits. 4,751 people looked at it. Actually, it was 4,750 until I did it, so I added one more to it. But anyway, he's got all sorts of one of the things that's up there are civil unions as opposed to marriages. I've always been a bit confused about that, and maybe Ted can sort of straighten it out for us one time. We'll talk to him again about. He's got a couple of different items up there that are pretty interesting, and that was somebody Lauren found somewhere, and it's worked out pretty cool. He's been out twice, and I think both times he's been pretty interesting, and so that's our second conversation about weed, and I like when those guys. He did say marijuana a couple times though. He didn't say cannabis all the time. He did say marijuana once or twice, and he did say pot too, didn't he?
Well, I think it was interesting we got the explanation as to why marijuana isn't the proper term, because it kind of was a slang term for the products grown out of Mexico.
Uh-huh.
So that was interesting because I always wondered that. What's the difference? I mean, it's we talked about NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws.
Yeah.
They say marijuana, and of course there are tons of the other nicknames.
Right. I like saying weed.
Yes.
I heard Whoopi Goldberg say weed all the time, and that always cracks me up when she says weed. Yeah, I smoked weed. So what? All right. So that was Ted Corless. Ted Corless is an attorney in Tampa, Florida, and it's always cool to talk to him and see what's going on in his mind. It's hard to tell what's going to happen when we come back. It's not hard to tell. There'll be no one here from Jersey Shore or Cape Regional.
Nope. We are open.
We're open for the 2 o'clock hour. Oh, good. So we can generate some phone calls. I have some interesting stuff here, I think, that we can talk about when we get back in the 2 o'clock hour. And I got some pretty cool history things, and I found some stuff that I really liked, and maybe I'll break out my list here of 7 reasons why you should have a dog and 7 things you shouldn't say to somebody that owns a cat. When I break out the list, that always makes phone calls. I guess people don't want to talk about it, so they call to have me just shut up instead of talking about dumb things like this. But I got a pile of stuff here that we can talk about, or we can talk about the very first Mustang ever sold. Matt Tennyson sent me this, and I'd seen this before, and I think I'm just going to have to. I probably kept the other one I have, but I'll have to keep this one too to just to put it away. But it's the first Mustang ever sold, and the lady still owns it. Still owns it. She bought it in 1964, but we can talk about that when we come.